The following Shat The Movies commission review is brought to you by listener Joshua, who decided we should watch The Crow. Fire it up, Joshua. Fire it up.
Remember when we first met John McClane? Argyle picked him up from the plane and took him down the Nakatomi Tower at the Christmas party. And the terrorists were overzealous, but it was sweet when they killed Ellis. And with a little help from Alan, John McClane kicked ass. We're gonna die.
Welcome back to Shat The Movies, the podcast where we ask, were the movies we loved when we were growing up really that good? Have you caught yourself thinking, why don't they make movies like they used to? Can you still remember spending your Friday night searching for the perfect movie rental at Blockbuster Video? Do you know what Blockbuster Video is? If you answered yes, then this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Gene Lyons, and alongside me are my two co-hosts, the King Bee.
I hate you, Raj.
And Kerri Gross.
I feel like a little worm on a big fucking hook.
And together, we're going to take a look back in time and decide if our favorite films still hold up. Each week, the audience selects from 6 movie choices that we break out in the race car VHS tape rewinder and watch the movie that tallied the highest number of votes. At the end of each podcast, the 3 of us will provide the audience with the number of wipes each movie would take to get off our respective bums. So find a comfortable spot on the sofa and accompany us for a journey through our vast VHS movie collections. If you'd like to download Shat The Movies, you can get it on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora, or wherever fine podcasts are found. This week's movie review is long overdue, and thankfully someone had the guts and the money to commission it. So it's 1994's classic and Brandon Lee's swan song, The Crow, commissioned by listener Joshua. Joshua writes, "Dear Shat The Movies, I'm a longtime listener and love the podcast. Few movies have had a special place in my cinematic memory like 1994's The Crow. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, like many kids, I was drawn to martial arts films, and despite my parents' Sunday morning conservatism, when it came to movies, they lacked the follow-through to properly censor my brothers and I from most R-rated flicks. The likes of Jean-Claude Van Damme, Steven Seagal, Chuck Norris, and by virtue of martial arts movie heritage, Bruce Lee, were always only a short trip to the local video store or HBO feature presentation away. It was via this lineage that my brothers and I first got introduced to Brandon Lee, long before he was ever mentioned for the title character of Eric Draven in James O'Barr's adaptation. Unlike most people who stumbled into The Crow through word of mouth, I came to the movie from a different avenue. I wasn't goth, couldn't have cared less about The Cure, nor was I heavily into comics. However, I had known of Brandon's work dating all the way back to 1986's Kung Fu, the movie. My twin brother and I followed his career through other, at best, B-movie slugfests, until Brandon started moving into more low-budget feature action film roles, a la 1991's Showdown in Little Tokyo, opposite Dolph Lundgren, and 1992's Rapid Fire, opposite Powers Booth. These guilty pleasures only made us more excited when we learned that he'd signed a 3-picture deal for The Crow, which we firmly believed would be his breakthrough role. Sadly, with only 8 days of filming left, Brandon was tragically shot and died in surgery after a prop gun mishap fired a live round, fatally striking him in the chest. Hearing the news, I was not only saddened that I may never get to see his latest and the greatest work, but that most people would never get to know the actor on the cusp of stardom that I'd come to like so much in my adolescence. Thankfully, Miramax ultimately picked up the rights to the film from Paramount, and after months of delay and with the help of some groundbreaking technology, the world got its neo-gothic classic. I can still remember cajoling my mom into buying my twin brother and I tickets in the summer of 1994, and walking into the theater at the age of 13, ecstatic that I was finally getting to see the movie on the big screen. The film is, however, not without its flaws. Some of the effects look dated, the sound editing is off during several key sequences, the acting is at times formulaic, and there are cutscenes leaving plot holes in Eric's story arc due to the story being forced in a single film versus a series. That said, The Crow, as well as 1987's Monster Squad, were sarcastically required viewing for any serious relationship I had, and when I saw a copy of The Crow in my now-wife's DVD collection after we first met, I joked to myself that I might have found the one. I was happy to see that the final cut was not the typical martial arts film that, given Brandon's namesake, he could have easily been typecast into, but as Roger Ebert called it, a stunning work of visual style. As for the soundtrack, I think a 2018 Revolver magazine retro review put it best when they wrote, "When it comes to this unfuckable with legacy, we have only one real question, great soundtrack or the greatest soundtrack?" The soundtrack is a time capsule of 90s alternative and industrial rock and is still in my top 5 movie soundtracks of all time, packed with such classics as Stone Temple Pilots' Big Empty and Nine Inch Nails' cover of Joy Division's Dead Souls. Watching Brandon quote from Paul Bowles' Sheltering Sky in one of his last behind-the-scenes interviews is tragically ironic, and unfortunately, the 3 subsequent sequels only got exponentially worse. The most recent, 2005's The Crow Wicked Prayer, is, without hesitation, the worst movie I've ever seen. Normally I just turn a bad movie off, but that movie is such a fecal stain on the cinematic landscape that I watched it end to end in awe, constantly thinking to myself, this can't possibly get any worse, can it? Only to continuously be reassured that yes, it could. It's a movie so bad that, if given the choice, I guarantee it would make each of you Shat The Movies hosts beg to watch Showgirls on repeat 24/7 for weeks on end while yearning for a PBS pledge break manned by the brownies from Willow versus seeing it again. As a result, in my mind, we're left with simply The Crow, a graphic noir tragedy for who we lost during the making, but a triumph for what Brandon would be remembered for. Some films don't need to be the greatest of all time to be the greatest we remember, and that for me sums up The Crow, a movie that, if asked, I would pick above all others to take with me to a desert island, if for nothing more than nostalgia. Objectively, I'd say it's in the 2-ish Shat score arena, but nostalgically, it's a half a wipe. All the best and keep up the great work. Joshua.
I'm sorry in advance for the fact that I'm about to shit all over your terrible movie.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised when I went on Twitter and we got a bunch of messages on Twitter and even on Snapchat saying that they're really excited that we're doing The Crow. And I thought I was being trolled. So I responded back and said, well, what kind of things do you like about The Crow? These are some of the things I got. The acting, the interesting world that they created, the effects, and even the fight scenes. So we've got a lot to say about that. Surprisingly, nobody mentioned the soundtrack, which I thought was really the strong suit of this movie.
I feel like it had to be done. You know, it's one of those ones people have been wanting us to do for a while. So I'm thankful for the commission. I'm just thinking we might not give this person the review that they paid for.
Yeah, so Charles, in advance, we apologize, but we do thank you for the opportunity to review this movie because I think we're going to have a lot of fun reviewing it. For those who haven't seen The Crow, it is and I'm not talking about the one with Kirsten Dunst in it, but the original Crow in 1994. It was an American supernatural superhero film starring Brandon Lee in his final film appearance. The film is based on James O'Barr's 1989 comic book, The Crow, and tells the story of Eric Draven, played by Brandon Lee, a rock musician who is revived from the dead to avenge his own death, as well as the rape and murder of his fiancée. Lee was wounded on set by a defective blank and later died during surgery, so with only 8 days left of production, the script was rewritten and unfinished scenes used a stunt double and digital special effects. The Crow is well received critically for its unique visual style, premise, and emotional depth. The film opened at the top of the box office and attained a strong cult following. It's the first installment of a franchise which includes 3 sequels and a TV series. So highly popular. And again, interestingly enough, even on Rotten Tomatoes, I think it has like something like above 80 freshness score. So we might be wrong here. We may be in the minority, but we'll get to that. So I've got to ask, starting with you, King B, where were you the first time you saw this movie?
I was on my couch yesterday. Okay. You know, everyone, I'm of the age group that everyone was supposed to love this movie. I was the target demographic, and I was the target they missed. I was surrounded by goth friends, but I was the token not goth, I guess, in the group.
See, that's interesting because I thought that I was the goth friend as the token goth in a bunch of like rockabilly kids and ska kids in our friend group. So,
I mean, I always just wanted to pick up one of the goth girlfriends that seemed to be flitting around because they seemed like they'd be dirty fun. But all the, you know, the shit on their faces and the dark and brooding over nothing, it did not appeal to me. And so I knew this movie had nothing for me when I was younger. Never picked it up until yesterday when I was asked to do it because Raj wasn't able to. I think he was getting a colonoscopy. So, you know, prayers for Raj and prayers for me.
Okay. Well, if you're interested in any of those goth girls that were floating around at the time, they're probably all still mostly single, and I can introduce you to some of them. So
I've moved past that phase.
All right. Speaking of goth girls, Kerri, when's the first time you saw The Crow?
I don't remember the first time I saw it. When did it come out? 96?
94.
94. So I was just a child. I definitely saw it in my teenage years. You know, it's a staple in the goth culture. I've seen it a few times, but I can't think of anything specific.
So one thing to always remember, like with that 94 thing that was kind of shocking to me is just the fact that this is the same year that Pulp Fiction came out. And whenever I'm trying to rate a movie, I go, what was the best movie that year that came out? Or like, what was the most like innovative or interesting movie at the time? So I'll be referencing that a few times through this. For me, I had just gotten my official goth card, so I was 14 years old, and I just started going clubbing at the Nile Theater in Mesa. And this is back in the days, I don't know if you guys remember this, but when the club had a single CD player, and they actually had to change the CD out, so there was like these weird 30-second to a minute pauses between songs where you could actually like talk to people. It was really bizarre. The DJs weren't really mixing at the time, at least at goth clubs. I'm sure at other clubs they were, because we were always behind. I felt like you did, Kerri, that this is kind of required viewing, like I was supposed to watch it. But I remember even as a kid, I never really cared for the acting in this movie, and I thought the plot was just kind of really simplistic and kind of dumb. But I remember being really impressed by the fight scenes and thinking that they were really cool, a lot of like gunplay and exciting, stuff going on the screen. And we'll see how well that holds up as we go through the podcast. With that being said, let's go with the trailer.
Devil's Night is upon us again. Throw a little party, start a bunch of fires, make a little profit.
When someone's dead, they can't come back, can they?
That's what I thought. Are you referring to anyone in particular?
You know, my daddy used to say, every man's got a devil. You can't rest till you find him.
Winked at me before he jumped out a fourth-floor window like he had wings.
Is his link between the land of the living and the realm of the dead.
So you killed the crow.
Call, bang, I'm dead!
I bashed the devil's stood and felt how awful goodness is. How awful.
On Devil's Night in Detroit, Police Sergeant Albrecht investigates a crime scene where Shelley Webster has been left for dead while her fiancé, Eric Draven, has died on the street outside after being thrown out a window. The couple were to be married the following day on Halloween. Albrecht meets a young girl, Sarah, who says that Shelley and Eric take care of her. 1 year later, Eric comes back to life and has flashbacks of the murders, remembering that those responsible were T-Bird and his gang, made of Tintin, Fun Boy, and Skank. Eric soon discovers that any wounds he receives heal immediately, and guided by a crow, he sets out to avenge his and Shelley's murders by killing the perpetrators.
Okay, so first of all, we have this character, Sarah, who is what appears to be a 12 to 13-year-old girl, and the beginning opening scenes are narrated by her. Gene and I were watching it together before I fell asleep, and it starts in where she's like, people once believed that when someone dies, a crow carries their soul, blah, 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 blah. I thought it was terribly annoying, and I looked up to see if that actress ever became anything, and I guess she was so traumatized by the on-set death of Brandon Lee that she didn't film anything until the late 2000s, so I kind of feel bad for her that this was her one and only shining moment.
Yeah, I'm sure that's why she didn't film anything.
Look, man, she had cool braids. She had a sweet outfit. She was like, they really tried to make her the epitome of like what was cool in the mid-90s. She had a skateboard in Detroit, which that would never work because of potholes.
She had a choker. She had an undercut. She had Doc Martens. She had fishnet stockings. She was the coolest 12-year-old, honestly.
Yeah, she was the troubled street kid starter kit for sure.
So I guess that brings us to the point, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, Brandon Lee's death. This is undoubtedly what made the movie more popular, drove people to the box office. And if anybody brings up The Crow, you can't get around Brandon Lee's death.
Upon research, I mean, everyone's heard the story that, a blank was shot at Brandon Lee during the him intruding on the rapist, raping his fiancée. A blank was shot at him that killed him.
Intruding on the rapist?
Yeah. I'll redo it.
Pardon me, sir.
Excuse me, this is my rape.
Mayhap you cease with the raping of my fiancée?
Excuse me, sir. Can you not rape me? Anyway, he was shot with what was like a defunct blank and, was sent to the emergency room where he spent 6 hours in surgery later to die. I know that his mom had sued the company. They settled out of court. She got over $3 million. But one of the stipulations was that the footage of him being shot was to be destroyed. Bruce Lee had once had a premonition that his son was going to be shot. So it has all these, hidden theories of it's a cursed film.
If you take into account, though, how many times parents have premonitions of their kids dying, like if it happens at all, they're going to be like, see, I was right. Like, I think my mom has probably, had some sort of a dream or a feeling that something bad was going to happen to me.
It was that King Bee's fault. I knew it.
Well, I mean, me and motorcycles and scooters don't mix very well.
Yeah. Yeah.
A gun that shoots blanks is a gun. Like, it is not a fake gun. It's the charge, it's the round that you put in it that's a blank. So any gun that shoots blanks can be lethal. And if there's anything, the way a firearm works is if there's any explosion in that chamber and there's anything clogging up that barrel, it's coming out and it's coming out fast. So
you're going to get a great illustration of this sort of idea in a later scene in the pawn shop when the crow, Mr. Draven, loads up a shotgun barrel with a bunch of wedding rings that were ill-begotten gains from the gang, and he uses it to shoot at the pawn shop.
And recently, if you might have read in the news, I think it was a Florida man who filled up a shotgun with Rice Krispies and fired at an intruder, not killing him, obviously.
No kidding.
Not killing him, huh? The actor Michael Massey, who plays Fun Boy, is the one that actually shot Brandon Lee. And he took a year-long sabbatical after Brandon Lee's death. And in an interview I read that he never actually watched the finished film, that it was too traumatizing for him. But there were several accidents during the production that led to the widespread belief that the film was cursed. There was a carpenter that suffered serious burns. There was another worker who was impaled by a screwdriver. A truck burst into flames. A stuntman broke several ribs falling through the roof. One worker was horribly electrocuted, and then a set designer apparently went nuts and drove his car through the prop room, destroying most of the set. And then during shooting, a hurricane destroyed several sets. And the scene where Brandon Lee is swinging through the glass window was actually, I guess, real glass, and he ended up cutting his palms pretty severely. So before he was shot and killed, there was a lot of speculation that the set and the film was cursed.
Yeah, I guess they just don't make them like they used to. One of the things I noticed while watching this movie is there's a lot of parallels between this and other films that I've seen that are comic book adaptations, where there's kind of a gross overuse of animation in the film that kind of, when they did these sweeping looks at what is supposed to be Detroit, it looked nothing like Detroit. And it had a very cartoonish feel. It didn't really sit well with me. I would have liked it to be, to quote Raj, a little more gritty like Ninja Turtles, and it wasn't quite there.
There's a comic book term, actually, that became pretty popular as a goof. It's things were now grim and gritty for the 90s. And it really applies to this movie. In that opening sequence, the first thing I thought was, I'm watching the Sin City movie from Robert Rodriguez and Frank Miller, which was just a shot-for-shot remake of the comic book. I did some Googling. I noticed that the Sin City comic came out in 1991, right about the time they probably would have started working on this movie. And the O'Barr comic came out in 89. So it's obvious one thing, in my opinion, totally influenced the next, which bled into this horrible mess.
Movies based on comic books generally aren't a genre that I enjoy, but I tried to keep that in mind when judging this movie, that it is based on a comic book and it's supposed to be portrayed in that kind of filter. So it made me hate it less. The scenes where he's like putting on his makeup and swinging out the window, things like that. I'm like, this is a comic book movie. It could have been done better for sure, but it wasn't just a drama.
The original Crow comic it's sketched in black and white. And so this movie was very highly color saturated. They talked about it in the production that they basically said that they tried to make it so dark, and a lot of critics picked up on it too, that it was its own color palette. Like it was this very dark, everything was in the shadows, but it didn't really work for me. It was hard to see what the hell was going on.
I did read that O'Barr had intended for it to be filmed in black and white, but that executives denied that. But he, in an interview on the DVD special features, said that when he met with the execs, that they were really pushing him to make this a musical and that they really wanted Michael Jackson to play the part of Eric.
See, in the way that I appreciated Jingle All the Way, I think I would have liked that a lot more than this. A musical starring Michael Jackson as The Crow would have been. It would have been basically The Wiz.
No, it wouldn't have been The Wiz. I think this would have been Michael's chance to really shed that very shiny pop music nature of his and really have this was going to be his breakout role. I'd love to see Michael Jackson in it. It'd give him a chance to be more human.
Yes, guys. So let's get Michael Jackson on the horn, get him on this next project, remaking The Crow. It's going to be great. But beyond all that, let's put the production aside. And I think that this movie, from the script itself, already like suffers from a lot of problems. Like just the entire genesis of it really bothers me. And I think a good example of that is everything seems to have been done on the cheap. The gang names really caught my ear, and I was just like, this can't be. Is that so? And I was like, what does this remind me of? And it reminds me of like if there was an amateur writer who like spent his nights drinking at the Elks Lodge, and he's like, all right, I got to come up with some tough, like gritty gang names. And remember, this is like a street gang, right, in Detroit. And they came up with Fun Boy, Tintin, T-Bird, Top Dollar. Like it doesn't make sense. And thankfully, they actually combined some of the characters in this movie. So they're actually more gang members, and they kind of combined them in. And then the other thing that really bothered me, and this is not O'Barr's fault in the creation of the comic, but Eric's last name, Draven, I was like, DeRaven. That was not O'Barr's thing. He just called him Eric. So they actually added that in for the movie, which makes it even worse. So you're combining rape, murder, and then like these silly names. It just didn't sit well with me. Like the movie couldn't figure out what it wanted to be. So the Crow helps Eric locate Tintin, who stabbed him the year before. Eric kills Tintin with his own knives and then takes his coat, leaving the crow symbol drawn in Tintin's blood. He torches a pawn shop where Tintin pawned Shelley's engagement ring, and Eric then runs into Albrecht and explains who he is and why he is here before vanishing. Funboy and Sarah's drug-addicted mother, Darla, are caught by Eric in the midst of their drug session, and before killing Funboy with a fatal overdose of morphine, Eric talks to Darla, expelling the drug from her arm and making her realize that Sarah needs her to be a good mother.
Okay, I need to address something that I should have addressed right when we started this movie. The fact that it's called The Crow, none of the birds in the film are actually crows, they're ravens. And then the scene where Brandon Lee is repeating an excerpt from Poe's The Raven, I think it was to the pawn shop guy.
Mm-hmm.
Why the fuck is this even called The Crow if everything in the movie is ravens?
Yeah, Eric. It's not Eric DePoe.
Well, they couldn't call it The Corvids.
They could have called it The Raven.
Well, I guess. Maybe O'Bar just wouldn't have it.
Okay, what is the difference between a crow and a raven?
Size, the sound they make when they caw. And so they actually had ravens in the film because they make a more distinct sound. But then just call it the fucking raven.
So typically, as I understand it, ravens are the things that you imagine. They're larger. They have a more pronounced beak. They are louder. They're a little bit more aggressive. A crow is smaller. If you know what a grackle is.
I do know what a grackle is.
A crow is kind of in between a grackle and a raven. Grackles have yellow eyes, however. Crows do not.
So what I'm thinking is that maybe they couldn't have a raven sit on someone's shoulder, like in size-wise, but then they do for the film. So it just doesn't make any sense to me.
So I'm a big fan of ravens, not crows, apparently.
So I got to say, the fact you're taking issue with crows really boggles my mind, considering a lot of the performances we're getting throughout this movie. I don't understand the Brandon Lee thing, aside from dying, that's a shame. It's a bummer when people die, or so I've heard. But I look at the guy's filmography, and it's just a bunch of like C-list versions of Under Siege. The guy was not making great films. I can't believe he was a fantastic talent. And his performance in this is just not good. The guy's confronting the guy who raped and murdered his wife.
Fun boy.
This is during Tintin. Just out of nowhere, with less energy than I have to mull it out. He goes, You cut her. You raped her. I can't buy into it. It's like Tommy Wiseau is delivering these lines.
I mean, to be fair, this guy was just stabbed, burned, thrown out a window. I think he was shot too, thrown out a window, and then buried for a year. So maybe he's just not, his vocal cords and his acting aren't really quite up to par. He's the undead.
I love that when we were watching this, Gene was like, this corpse was stabbed, burned, thrown out the window, but it's somehow in perfect condition. I'm like, yeah, he also was dead for a year and climbed out of his grave, and now he's invincible.
Well, also let's talk about the boots. So he gets his boots in a very Terminator fashion. Like Terminator gets his his clothes off. This is Detroit. You're not finding shoes that are usable in a dumpster anywhere in the city. Like they will be scavenged long before the crow gets there. No pun intended.
Let alone like PVC and latex and face paint.
Well, just the notion that he crawls from his grave, he's disoriented. He has no idea where he is or what he's doing. And there's not one open building he can stop in and ask for help on the way. He just shambles without a shirt in the freezing cold all the way home.
The whole thing is a setup, supposedly, for the son of Bruce Lee. It's a vehicle for him to shine, right? Like, he finally got his big movie. And you mentioned before that he's been in a lot of shitty movies. I watched a YouTube clip when I was like, what style of fighting did Brandon Lee do? And he sometimes dipped into the Jeet Kune Do that Bruce Lee was doing, but he had no interest in like carrying that mantle of like forwarding that entire fighting system. And so in other movies that I've seen him in, it's a lot of like bullshit Hollywood fighting, like flips and rolling under tables and stuff like that. And so we finally see him fight somebody. And the first fight he has, as you mentioned, is Tintin. And there is some hand-to-hand there because he hasn't gotten himself a weapon yet. And it sort of resembles what you'd expect from the son of Bruce Lee. But that is really the last time we see Brandon Lee do any martial arts of note. The rest of it, he's mostly shooting guys or like killing them in increasingly quirky ways. And I think one of the ways that comic books have improved over the last 2 decades, or comic book movies, is that you see a lot more of that hand-to-hand and a lot more fight choreography. So even if you look at, like, say, like the Avengers Infinity War, there's really no reason for people to be even fighting hand-to-hand. This is a cosmic battle. But you still got, your Black Widows and your Black Panthers and your Captain Americas that are still out there slugging it out, and doing something that at least resembles a believable fight.
I do recall an off-camera leg sweep that looked pretty convincing. Beyond that, you're absolutely right. I really want to like this Brandon Lee character because he's such a quote-unquote legend, but he's not giving me much to work with.
I don't think it's fair to judge someone under the shadow of their parents' skills or abilities.
I'm judging him on this movie.
So Albrecht tells Eric what he knows about Shelley's death and that he watched as she suffered for 30 hours before dying. Eric touches Albrecht and receives from him the pain felt by Shelley during those hours. Eric kidnaps T-Bird in his own car and ties T-Bird to the car, which is full of explosives. Then he primes a grenade inside before putting the car in drive, forcing T-Bird to drive it off the edge of a pier when the grenade explodes and sinks the exploding car into the harbor, killing T-Bird as Skank watches from afar. Eric then leaves a burning crow symbol behind.
I watched all of this, I'm not kidding you, just a few hours ago. And between then and now, forgot this entire scene until you read it to me.
As I mentioned before, this whole like increasingly quirky ways of killing people, again, in the book, in the comic book, and not to say that it's a great comic book by any means, but he's much more efficient. He's just popping bullets in people's heads. Like, he's not really doing this, like, let's do the grenade and the car full of explosives. And I get it. It's poetic. Like, you kill people in the way that they lived, right? The morphine for Fun Boy, the explosives for T-Bird in a car.
Which one does he rape?
I'm glad you bring that up. Did rape really have to be a part of this?
I would argue that Shelley didn't even have to be part of it, because when you think about it, like, you got murdered, now you're seeking revenge. That's all that really needs to happen. And I think the fact that they went down that romantic route, which is, again, a hallmark of the 90s, I think we've sort of shed that in the 2000s, at least getting kind of away from that. There always has to be revenge for a lost lover or, a wife or whatever. But yeah, they really laid it on thick with the, they're a couple, they're in love. Those love scenes were terrible.
Awful.
Guess we're going to a restaurant or whatever.
It was a really, this is the cinematic version of a 90s power ballad.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely, mirrored in 90s power ballad music videos. Like, he's burning her portrait in the apartment that they lived in, and there's flashbacks that he's swinging her around in a field of flowers. None of it seems realistic. It's very over dramatized. It felt like a music video, but without any music, other than when he's playing the guitar, just 4 chords loudly on the roof of the apartment.
Well, the notion that a poor artist couple can afford Dr. Strange's apartment in a big city, and then it goes unrented for a fucking year after they're dead. There's just too much missing in this movie.
Welcome Detroit in the 90s. That's actually the most plausible part of this movie. And speaking of Detroit, I just want to take a moment to say, hey, I'm a big fan of Detroit. I love the city of Detroit. I love the International Auto Show. I love Greektown. Great goth scene, great industrial scene. Lots going on there that's really cool. But Detroit is RoboCop City, and we've seen Detroit in film, in RoboCop, in Beverly Hills Cop, and that is the kind of gritty that you want. They didn't have to set this in Detroit. And I found that very distracting because I was like, this looks nothing like Detroit. It looks like a Hollywood backlot. And one of the things that was really telling for me is, did you guys notice that when the cops show up, it's always like after shit went down and they just have their lights flashing and they're all just milling about in the street?
That's how police work, sir.
But then it brings me to Albrecht. How is Albrecht so different? He seems to be the only cop who's doing anything, except for he has Devil's Night off the second time around, which I'm a little confused by. But he's another one of those characters that I mentioned was a mashup of two other characters. And this, again, takes you back to kind of just the quality of writing that's going on with this. So there were two characters in the comic book. One is like this rookie cop with a heart of gold. The other one is this veteran cop who goes by the name of Captain Hook. So listen, I love Ernie Hudson, and he really does his best in this movie. But I'm thinking that a real cop, if a guy just showed up in his apartment dressed like an industrial clown, and then he realizes the guy's been dead for a year, he's not going to just sit down and have a conversation with him in his underwear. Like, dude's going to be on high alert.
He's seen a lot of things on these tough Detroit streets that don't have to necessarily be Detroit streets.
With their jazz music hot dog stands.
Does it actually rain that much in Detroit?
Well, it doesn't rain all the time.
It's raining the entire film.
Well, it's only 2 days. The whole movie is just 2 days.
Well, and 1 year later.
Yeah, but it's 2 days.
2 of the longest days.
So Sarah and her mother begin to repair their strained relationship. Sarah tells Eric that she misses him, and Eric explains that even though they cannot be friends anymore, he still cares about her. Top Dollar, a top-level criminal who controls all the street gangs in the city, and his half-sister, Micah, had become aware of Eric's actions from witnesses. Top Dollar holds a meeting with his associates, but Eric interrupts the meeting looking for Skank. Eric seizes several guns and shoots every one of Top Dollar's henchmen. Top Dollar and Micah manage to escape during the gunfight, while Eric kills Skank by throwing him out a window before evading police capture. Micah, who is a follower of mysticism, says Eric can be defeated by killing his crow guide.
So they really want me to believe that this fucking drug addict whore mom is going to wake up and make Sarah sunny side up eggs and everything is just forgiven.
Yeah, this movie is living in that same dream world where if you get somebody clean off of drugs, like you get them to sweat it out and dry out, that they're going to be fine. Not taking into account the fact that it's probably her lifestyle that got her into the drugs. And the first thing that she's going to need after getting the morphine pumped out of her veins somehow magically by the crow is probably another fucking hit.
Well, that's a mystical pumped out of your veins morphine. It's not the same. Morphine. You should not do morphine. You should not.
So while we're doing Tommy Wiseau accents, I want to talk about Micah. She, is just kind of, again, not in the book. She just happens to show up for the movie. And she is the half-sister of Top Dollar, but they're also apparently like fucking. Like it's like some incestuous relationship. And I don't understand, like she knows about the crow somehow, but they don't really explain like what kind of mystic she is. She likes eyeballs, I guess, whatever kind of mystic that is. And Top Dollar seems to be attracted to her only in moments that he can creep people out by like hitting on her. And I think she's supposed to be sexy. Like she's putting her heels up on people and she's like got her boobies out and stuff. I mean, not out, but Detroit exposed. Her outfits I thought were like really terrible. Like, again, this is the mid 90s. We can do better than this. And then there was the whole lip liner thing. It was the stuff of nightmares.
Who was the evil band that fought Jem? She looked like one of the third tier misfits that never got a line in the cartoon.
The Asian one.
Well, I didn't want to say it, but yeah, the Asian one.
Yeah, there was a lot of like odd, and this is again, I think a 90s like goth movie thing, and it even extended all the way to like the Blade era, is that whenever you had like any sort of a, like you had to have like, there's this like kit that you had basically, right? You pop it open and you have to have a katana blade. You've got to have like some sort of an Asian like sidekick or lover or something like that. You've got to have corsets, some sort of, and then long hair and usually trench coats. Like this was just an ensemble that you had to put together. And I feel like they just checked everything off the fucking box on this one.
This was about the time that I fell asleep the first time.
Lucky.
When my Thrill Kill Cult starts playing and there's a massive shootout and I'm just snoozing comfortably.
Yeah, this is a surprisingly loud movie, but not like super exciting. It's really weird because we were watching True Detective by the way, we're covering True Detective. You should know that by now.
It's real good.
Yeah, you should go to shathunttv.com, check out True Detective. Go subscribe right now. iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, Pandora. But anyway, we were watching that and like very quietly with scenes that involve very little sound, very little flash. Your heart is racing. And in this, you had just unlimited gunfire, shit's breaking everywhere. People are flying through tables and windows and stuff. And I just didn't find myself caring that much.
What was the purpose of this gang?
I can answer that. So the idea is that Top Dollar, he is masking it under this like anarchy that basically like Devil's Night is a way to like send a beacon of fire to the world to let them know that Detroit is wild and that their power is unrivaled and whatever. But what you see he's doing is he's actually trying to, I think, devalue these properties because he's a property owner, right? So he's like, they did not need to do this. And again, in the comic book, this is just a street gang, and Top Dollar is not like some big boss. He's just a member of the street gang, and they just do it for the fucking fun of it, right?
So he has his guys break into Eric and Shelley's apartment, rape her, destroy the property, and kill them both just to devalue that loft apartment.
Well, just specifically to get them to move out.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, they're dead, so they had to move out. And then it was left vacant for a year.
Well, yeah, because he's waiting for the property to be devalued. But here's the thing is that the gang too, I mean, they even say it in some weird roundabout logic to Eric. They're like, look, you weren't supposed to show up. We were just going to go in there, fuck shit up and leave. Nobody had to die, So basically, that was their logic. Was look, it's not really our fault. You just kind of showed up at the wrong time. You interrupted the rape.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That action sequence is a mess. At one point, a guy gets pulled underneath a table, and so people on one side of the table are just shooting wildly underneath a table, not knowing. It's clear they can't see what they're shooting at, but it's right underneath the table in front of them. I can see underneath the table I'm sitting at right now. How could you miss? It cuts to the other side of the table is shooting across the table at the Crow as he's beating up on a guy, and they're not 8 feet away. There's a line of men with guns shooting at a man 8 feet away, and where are these bullets going?
Okay, I will, on behalf of this movie, since it can't speak for itself, and since Brandon Lee is dead, and James O'Barr is God knows where, it's a comic book. Look, Batman can pop into a room and knock 13 dudes out with his fists alone that are armed with guns because he's using darkness and stealth. And maybe the Crow is somewhat similar. And the henchmen are generally not that, well equipped. So, I mean, because if we're going to go there, we can go with like why they have a giant boardroom. Like, why is this guy who owns like, most of Detroit associating with like these weirdos?
Well, for crime.
Bad horse.
Duh.
So Sarah is abducted by Top Dollar's henchman, Grange, who takes her into a church where Top Dollar and Micah are waiting. Eric realizes what has happened and goes to rescue her, but Grange shoots the Crow as it flies into the church, making Eric lose his invincibility. Sergeant Albrecht arrives and fatally shoots Grange. When Albrecht is wounded, Eric climbs to the tower where he is confronted at gunpoint by Micah, but the Crow, or Raven, pecks out Micah's eyes and she falls to her death.
That's a hell of a crow. Just flies in there, gets shot right off the bat. Lays very, very still. He's biding his time. He's got one shot, and he's going to make it count. He can't just get the lady on the ground floor. No, she needs to climb. She climbs up the stairs, and then he finds his chance to strike. It's now! And instantly just takes out both of her eyeballs. She could just crumple to her knees, but no, she's got to leap over the railing, try to grab onto the rope of the bell. You got the church bells ringing. She falls to her death.
All right, I got a theory on that. If you watch the scene very, very closely, God, I'm a fucking Crow apologist.
I got a counter theory to your theory.
If you watch that scene closely, Brandon Lee, Eric Draven, is looking at the Crow, which she is holding, and I believe that it's a symbiotic relationship where the Crow powers him, but he also can power the Crow. He uses it for vision as it flies around and does surveillance for him. I believe that he willed the Crow to peck out her eyes. Now, why shouldn't it just fall down? I don't know. Also, I'm just saying, like, a bird that size, or even a dog that size, if I'm holding it and it begins to peck out one eye, I'm probably throwing it or swatting it the fuck away from my face.
Right. Yeah. Like, this crow's not as dead as I thought it was. Why did I haul it all the way up here? We just needed to kill the thing. I don't know why I felt the need to pick it up.
Well, I think
made a large mistake.
I think she was taking it because they wanted to like transpose the power to top dollar. That's why.
Was that stated?
Well, she discussed that the power could be removed from Eric via the crow. And so they wanted the crow to then have the power to top dollar.
Yeah, let's not forget, she's a mystic. So
she does follow the mysticism.
I don't know how she knows these things, but yeah, at the boardroom meeting, it was discussed.
Yeah, so I think part of it too is that she might just be nuts. So like even if she couldn't, she's collecting eyeballs. Like I think that, she probably just thinks, we can just extract this from the crow. It's very taboo. We also cover Taboo, by the way. We did season 1 last year. It's already there. If you go to Taboo FX, you can subscribe to us on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher.
So had they not shot the crow, would Eric would have just lived on for eternity fighting crime? Or would the spell have been completed after Halloween and he returns to being dead? I mean, what was the idea here?
I think the idea was to just, let's make a Hollywood movie. I don't really think they were thinking that far ahead.
I think that regardless of how the mission went, that he he has to avenge the deaths, and then because the whole premise, right, is that the crow is that if there's so much sorrow that the spirit cannot be carried away and it's got to stay and blah blah blah. So I think that the crow, even if it hadn't been shot, he would still disappear. Now there are several crow books, so I imagine if we went, hey, listen, if you're listening and you want to set us straight on the crow.
For all you Corvid crazies out there.
Yeah, hosts at shatthemovies.com. Write us and tell us about...
Set us straight.
Crow lore. I know that there is one book of the crow. King B, I know you've read them all. There's one book. There's one book of the crow where he's like on Indian land. It's like an Indian boy or a guy, like young man, and he gets like assaulted. I don't know if he gets killed or whatever, and he's telling people like not to desecrate the burial site, and they do anyway, and then he comes back to avenge it.
Well, once you run out all your ammunition on 90s power ballads, eventually you're going to get into Native American mysticism in the realm of white people making tacky art. That's just bound to happen.
So you mentioned that the delivery by Brandon Lee wasn't all that good. I thought he did an okay job on the first one, like on Tintin. Like he had this rage, and it was kind of, I could appreciate, and I said, maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe he's actually that good. And that was like the scene that he got right. And then the rest of it just went to hell. But it's not just him. Like I feel like they just did this improv class and they asked each actor to pick out an item and use it to express himself or herself. So like Micah's got that feather that she just keeps like, everybody she's talking to, she's got to use the feather and waft the feather around. Or Sarah's got the ring. She's like, the ring keeps getting returned to her and she just does things with the ring. Eric's got the guitar. Top Dollar's got the sword. Like everybody, I think that they needed like some sort of a token to help them act and just to interact with. And apparently Grange, she had that bluesman hat that was very distracting in every scene. What I noticed was Albrecht had this yellow jacket that he wore into a gunfight that in every scene, like everybody else was obscured by the darkness, but this motherfucker was out there like a banana in this gunfight. And of course he gets shot like directly in it.
That's why Batman gives Robin a yellow cape. He's the distractionary tactic.
Ah. What about the shorts though?
Well, that's the distractionary tactic for the creepos. You're those little boy butts.
All right, home stretch. Top Dollar holds Sarah hostage on a rooftop where he fights Eric. In their fight, Eric is fatally stabbed in the back. Before Top Dollar can kill Eric, Eric grabs Top Dollar's head and gives him the 30 hours of pain from Shelley he absorbed from Albrecht. The sensation sends Top Dollar falling from the roof of the church where he is fatally impaled on the horns of a gargoyle. As Albrecht is taken to the hospital, Eric is reunited with Shelley at their graves. The film ends with the crow returning Shelley's ring to Sarah before flying off into the night.
That has got to be one of the ugliest engagement rings I have ever seen. And was it even worth anything at that fucking pawn shop?
When I was a kid, I don't know if you guys had this, but when I was a kid in elementary school, they would have like these gift sales at the bookstore of the library of the school, like around the holidays and stuff. And I remember I would always go get my mom jewelry from these, and I thought they were so cool. And this is garbage, This ring looked like one of those rings. Like I don't think there was even a stone in it.
No, it was just metals. It wouldn't be worth $25. at any pawn shop, just because they're just using it for scrap.
Now, can you give us a breakdown on this ring?
Yeah, it was pretty simple. Probably, honestly, gold plated. If we're going to be honest, that means whatever was underneath it could have been brass or copper. Really cheap alloy. There's not a whole lot going on there. Again, nothing real valuable. Just the sentimental value.
Yeah, I mean, as Eric is at the pawn shop going through the box of rings, I'm like, dude, you can take any of these rings. And he's also like, each one of these rings was a soul or blah, blah. I'm like, how do you know? Some people probably just pawn their rings. Like, it's not, like, I really feel like the pawn shop guy really got the shit end of the stick. All he's doing is fencing. Like, big deal.
I thought that scene was supposed to show how crazy and out of whack. Like, he doesn't care that he's got this box of valuables. He's just throwing them away because he's just looking for that one.
It's like a prototypical Deadpool sort of thing, right? He's sitting cross-legged on the floor with abandon, not worrying about getting hurt in any way. He's just like...
Honestly, it was the inspiration for a lot of dumb stuff to come in the future. So I guess if there is one saving grace to the whole thing, it's that it really did pave the way for more bad art.
So speaking of bad art, I want to get to the final battle. This is supposed to be the... kind of the ultimate showdown between Top Dollar and Eric, and which is interesting too because Eric originally just wanted to take out the guys responsible for the attack on himself and Shelley, and then Top Dollar has to go off and admit he's like, it was me, it was my idea, I told them to do it, and then he's like, well shit, now I gotta go. Because if you remember, even in the boardroom scene, he's just after Skank. He's like, just give me that guy, I don't give a fuck, I'll get out of here. Which, by the way, Top Dollar realistically would have been like, fucking take him, I don't give a shit.
Right.
So anyway, but this last battle, it I don't know, it felt like to me like it was stolen straight from 1991's Disney's animated Beauty and the Beast, which again, you're talking about kind of 91 inspirations. There's the battle on the rooftop, there's the comeback kill, there's like the, you know, the pitched, the dark, you know, fight on top of the rooftop, and of course the gargoyles. It seemed like a dumb, really, really basic way to end the movie because they just couldn't figure out what to do. They're like, one guy's got a sword and the other guy is the crow.
Well, the notion that he pulls a weather vane off the top of the church and it's suddenly this very ornate, like snake entwined sword that he uses to battle the bad guy with his just regular kind of sword, I guess. It was a lot of melodrama going down there that I didn't really buy into. And then the brand new superpower they introduce just to close out the fight. Where did that come from? Is this power a bearer bond? What's the deal?
Well, what was interesting about it to me is, Kerri, you can correct me on this, but she was in the hospital for 30 hours, before she died as a result of her injuries. And the scenes were very like Flatliner-esque where they were kind of all from above. And it seemed like nobody was really doing anything. They were just kind of standing around her in like this blue tint. 30 hours, is that normal after an assault? Like for somebody to be in surgery or in ICU?
Yeah, I mean, I've had patients in the trauma ICU that were there for months. So what I thought was unrealistic is him saying pain, because that would be the one thing that we addressed, is that we would put you in a medically induced coma and therefore you wouldn't feel any pain.
See, I think it was the pain that Albrecht felt while watching her, right? Or maybe some sort of a spiritual pain. Because, yeah, I kind of thought the same thing. I'm like, she would be out, so why would she even know that? By the way, if you ever want to feel not comfortable with the idea of dying, talk to Kerri Gross about it. Because I used to think, I was like, when I get old, I'm going to live to a ripe old age when I'm going to wake up every morning and everything's going to be painful and I'm going to be tired. I'm just going to want to die. And she's like, nah. Most people just, they don't want to die. They're afraid. And I'm like, great. That sounds awesome. So
yeah, I think in like the 100 and something people I've seen die, like 2 were like, I'm ready to go.
I just assume it's like that Tom Waits song, Everybody Wants to Know the End.
Speaking of the end.
All right, now is the time during the podcast where we rate this movie on the Shat meter. If you've never listened to the podcast before or need a refresher, a Shat score of 0 is a perfect movie. It's coming out from the grave with your leather jacket, your pressed jeans, and finding a pair of boots in the dumpster that fit you perfectly. And 5 wipes is an absolute catastrophe of the movie. It is a car ride off of a dock with a grenade exploding in your crotch at just the right time before you hit the water. We'll start with you, Kerri Gross. What is your score for The Crow?
I tried to be very patient, understanding with this movie because of how culturally meaningful it is for the goth community. You know, it's referenced so much. Someone is always the Crow for Halloween or just on any Wednesday at the club. I love that it immortalizes goth culture. I loved the soundtrack. I really love the Nine Inch Nails cover of Joy Division. It's probably one of my favorite songs to dance to at the club. And, you know, it was thanks to this movie that it was brought into our community. And then The Cure wrote specifically for this movie the song Burn, which, as Gene was making fun of me, I'm always saying this is the only Cure song I like. But the script is terrible. The acting is shit. And the plot is dumb. I'm never going to watch it again. But it's not the worst movie we've reviewed, so I'm going to give it 4 wipes.
All right, that's 4 wipes from Kerri. King B.
You know, I was asked to do this last night in a last-minute endeavor. I had just settled in for the evening. I'm not kidding you. I was 5 minutes into watching Stanley Kubrick's 3-hour period epic Barry Lyndon when Gene said, "Hey, I need a big favor. Can you please watch The Crow tonight?" And I just thought, oh, I'm not going to like this at all. So I reluctantly left Barry Lyndon, which I had seen a handful of times before, but really, really enjoyed. It's 3 hours long anyway. And tucked in for The Crow. I never had interest in it as a child. I didn't want to be the naysayer in this podcast and hate it, so I tried to find something I liked, and I failed. Brandon Lee is not impressive. The cast is terrible. The set is ugly. Corvids are cool, I guess. Ernie Hudson's in it. Like, that guy deserves work. Why not? 4 wipes.
All right, that's 4 from Kerri and 4 from King B. And this is one of the few instances where I think we have a unanimous ruling on a movie. I'm also a 4 wiper on this. I felt, as Kerri said, the soundtrack was amazing. There were even some really interesting mixes there. So the vocalist from the Cocteau Twins was playing with Medicine, who's actually in the movie. My Life with Thrill Kill Cult was in the movie. And the Cure song was actually just Robert Smith and the drummer from The Cure, and they just did a 2-piece. So there were kind of some different sounds coming out of bands that you love. Also, other bands on this were Stone Temple Pilots, Rage Against the Machine. And this is a really, really solid soundtrack. The soundtrack still to this day is pretty amazing, but the rest of the movie it's hot garbage. And I would say that I'd take 1 wipe off because of the soundtrack, and also because this movie inspired at least one guy at every goth night to go balls out on his makeup. And I always appreciate that guy. Like, when you see him, you know you're going to have a good night. So again, you know, this movie served its purpose. I think that much like The Matrix and Edward Scissorhands, it kind of put the goth culture on the cinematic map, but at the same time, it is not the quality that those 2 movies are. So from the 3 of us combined, this is a solid 4 wipe movie. That puts The Crow at the number 79 spot, tied with Real Genius, Armageddon, and Arachnophobia. It is better than Time Cop and worse than A Christmas Story.
You guys gave 4 wipes to Christmas Story?
No, Christmas Story had 3.83 wipes.
Brutal.
It's a terrible movie. But not this terrible. That wraps up The Crow. Next week's movie is still undecided. So if you haven't checked it out yet, on shatthemovies.com, there's a calendar now, so you can look ahead and see what movies we're going to be doing next. That will allow you to watch them ahead of time, and so you know what the hell we're talking about. But next week's is actually such a close vote that we haven't decided yet. It's going to be the best of Rick Dukeman. So if you want to go vote, go to shatthemovies.com/vote, and you can vote and determine what movie we watch next. And also go ahead and check out that calendar and see what we're going to be doing down the way. There's a couple exciting ones, including Weekend at Bernie's. That concludes this week's episode of Shat The Movies. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat The Movies. At Facebook, you can search for Shat The Movies Podcast. The website is shatthemovies.com. If you'd like to email us with a suggestion for a movie or just some feedback, hosts at shatthemovies.com. If you know the difference between a crow and a raven, want to talk about that, hosts at shatthemovies.com. We're everywhere fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, be sure to leave a 5-star review. That helps the podcast grow. You can also check out our sister podcast, Shat on TV, where we'll be doing True Detectives, and we're just about to start on a marathon viewing of season 2 right now.
I'd rather go for a walk.
I'd rather watch The Crow for a second time.
If you're interested in watching True Detective, you can watch along with us for season 3. Go check all that out at shatontv.com. You can also see our reviews of TV series such as Westworld, Taboo, and American Gods, along with Game of Thrones. You can find all that information again at shatontv.com. On behalf of my co-hosts, Kerri Gross, The King Bee, Big D, Dick Ebert, and Roger Roper, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us next week for the best of Rick Dukeman. Thanks for listening. We'll see you soon.
Don't you see, we just uncovered a $2 million error. We're going to be heroes. We're going up the corporate ladder. It appears as if somebody's trying to defraud the company.
Somebody tried to smoke it past the wrong guy.
Very, very good work. How would you two like to come to my house at the beach?
Love to!
For Larry and Richard.
How are you?
This is a place to die for.
You have to kill them, Vito.
I'm a little rusty, but it'll come back to me.
What, should we just walk in?
But what they don't realize
No, we'll stand out here on weekend. Come on, we're house guests.
is while they're checking in,
Forget the accident with the two guys. Take care of Lomax.
Bernie Lomax will be checking out.
Oh, my God. What kind of a host invites you to his house for the weekend and dies on you?
I don't know.
Lomax told whoever he's talking to not to kill us if he's around, right?
Yeah, but Lomax is dead. He's not around anybody anymore.
I know that. You know that. Nobody else knows that. Huh?
Oh!
Push Bernie. It looks good enough. Let's go.
Uh-oh. Larry.
What? Huh?
Really?
Hi, Bernie. Hey, Bernie, just like last week, huh?
Oh, Bernie, you animal. You are insatiable.
Doesn't anyone realize he's dead?
Hold the boat. Got him? Hold the boat.
Vito, I'm telling you, Lomax is alive. Maybe Paulie is rustier than we thought.
Ooh, Bernie, you're starting to peel. I'll get you out of the sun, huh?
Is that the killer?
How do I know, Richard? Should I stop and ask him?
No, just drive.
Serpentine! Do you hear something? What is that? It's just Bernie!
Weekend at Bernie's.
Are we doing it again today?
Oh, absolutely. You know we are.
Great. We'll see you later, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, ladies. We'll see you later. God, is this great or what?